that into the fact where the victim is now the perpetrator and the perpetrator is now the victim. And that just drives me crazy.
So much together. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. Despite these holocausts, America is today the strongest, the most influential, and most productive nation in the world. Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment. Throughout America's adventure in free government, our basic purposes have been to keep the peace, to foster progress in human achievement, and to enhance liberty, dignity, and integrity among peoples and among nations. To strive for less would be unworthy of a free and religious people. Any failure traceable to arrogance or our lack of comprehension or readiness to sacrifice would inflict upon us grievous hurt, both at home and abroad. Progress toward these noble goals is persistently threatened by the conflict now engulfing the world. It commands our whole attention, absorbs our very beings. We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. Unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of indefinite duration. To meet it successfully, there is call for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint, the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty the stake. Only thus shall we remain, despite every provocation, on our charted course toward permanent peace and human betterment. Crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance in and among national programs. Balance between the private and the public economy. Balance between the cost and hoped for advantages. Balance between the clearly necessary and the comfortably desirable. Balance between our essential requirements as a nation and the duties imposed by the nation upon the individual. Balance between actions of the moment and the national welfare of the future. Good judgment seeks balance in progress. Lack of it eventually finds imbalance and frustration. The record of many decades stands as proof that our people and their government have, in the main, understood these truths and have responded to them well in the face of threat and stress. But threats, new in kind or degree, constantly arise. Of these I mention 2 only. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military
complex, and it's a term that is not much used these days. I saw a reference to it back in the early 1970s, and there's a discussion about it. There's a book that addresses some of these topics, but the actual term political industrial complex, for me anyway, came out of discussions with these gentlemen and other people and colleagues where I teach, and in the single payer movement, of which I'm a leader in Pennsylvania, and that is thinking about the departing words of Dwight David Eisenhower, quite honestly, the military-industrial complex. And what he warned us of in his farewell address was this merger or convergence of forces that are part of the military industry, the defense industry, both public and private, that threaten basic liberties in the United States. And I think that's a point even that Dave is alluding to, because I think one of the things that we should think about here is bringing activists together, even between Occupy and the Tea Party. As crazy as that may seem and sound to some people, there are some fundamental bridges to be discovered there, the basic anger. So if Occupy's primary grievance is with corporations, the Tea Party's is primarily with the government, I think you're going to find that the #1 issue for Occupy is the #2 issue for Tea Party, and the #2 issue for the Tea Party is the #1 issue for Occupy. So I think we need to broaden our thinking here and step away from, and this is part of understanding the political industrial complex, is stepping away from what I call our emotional politics. Drew Weston has written about the political brain. I don't know if you're familiar at all with his work, but the vast majority of my friends, activists, Democratic Party people that I've been associated with over the years are, in my view, constantly spun by the party in a way that precludes their thinking independently about what's actually going on. In other words, falling for the traps, the rhetoric, the language, as opposed to what's actually happening, what's actually being done in our name. So the political industrial complex, to get back to the point, and I'll finish with this, is the convergence of virtually every institution in American society being corporatized. Virtually every institution. So we're talking about the military, to begin with, to pick up on Eisenhower's theme, we're talking about the media, which Jerry's going to be talking about. We're talking about the medical industrial complex, which is what Walter's going to be talking about. We're talking about the whole campaign infrastructure of campaign finance and the way that politics are run primarily by the Democratic and Republican parties that Julie will be talking about. But because we only have so many spaces and so much time, it's important also to recognize that we have something called a prison industrial complex. We have an academic industrial complex. We have a sports industrial complex. And I could go down a litany of dozens of more institutions in our society. And speaking from a personal perspective, being the chair of faculty council where I teach, I sit on a board. And the people who occupy positions on that board are the muckety-mucks. They're the corporate CEOs of the local hospital, the insurance company, and so forth. So I'm watching it unfold. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion because it's something that I teach, it's something that I practice, it's something that I learn, and something that I collaborate with others. So I want to initiate the opportunity today to let's collaborate here, not only today, but as we leave today. If you want to leave names behind, we can network, exchange ideas. I've got a long list of books and journals that address any number of these topics. I've spent the last 2 years just collecting literature and identifying what exists. But the final point I want to make is that nobody, so far as I can tell, has connected all these dots. And that's my objective, that's my goal, that's my hope, is that we can spell it out for the American people before it's too late. And the point that I'll make when I do my presentation is that the Democratic Party has is no longer a liberal party, it is a neoliberal party, and the Republican Party is no longer a conservative party, it is a neoconservative party. But I would say less than 1% of Americans actually know what neoliberalism is. Most of them have never heard of the term neoliberalism. Most people have heard of the term neoconservatism, but I don't think very few people could actually identify it. I think that that's also part of this larger discussion. So it's this merger, this convergence of these corporatized institutions that have created this monolith, that have created this monster that threatens not only our basic liberties here at home, but also globally. So I'll stop there and turn over the discussion to, where were we going to go next?
I don't know if we discussed it. I don't care.
Okay. Jerry, why don't you start, and then Walter and Julian, and then wrap it back around. Let me get this wire.
That means can we move to the right?
It's good. For
the
audience, yeah, that's from our perspective.
Okay, good.
From the speakers, we're thinking.
Yeah, good.
There's nobody left of you. You know, I want to give a little context too, because it's funny. I think I started my political journey in 1966 when I was 19 years old. And now that I'm in my 60s, it's all starting to come together. And everybody in this room has said things that kind of resonate with where I'm coming from and where I'm going and what I see in the country right now. And Chuck talked about connecting the dots. I started out in I grew up in New York. I was not politically active. Came from a family. My father was in military intelligence. My mother was a secretary, and I wasn't political. My father was kind of liberal for somebody who was in military intelligence, but I became very enamored as a teenager of John Kennedy. And after he was assassinated, a few years later, I started reading about the Warren Report and got very caught up in that. And I became particularly caught up in the role of the media. And I really became kind of the expert in that field on the role of the media, and realized very early that we have a corrupt media that doesn't tell the truth. And which, I think a lot of people think what's going on with the media today is something new. It's gotten worse probably, but it's always been the case. And I got involved in the Vietnam War movement. Chuck ran for the Senate in Pennsylvania in 2006. He ran for the Democratic nomination. And I couldn't stand Bob Casey. I got involved in Chuck's campaign, and then Chuck got me involved in single payer after that campaign. But today, what I'm seeing is this huge convergence. The media is still very key. I hosted an event in Lancaster recently for Move to Amend, which is the organization that wants to do away with corporate personhood. And when you think about it, I mean, our problems with healthcare stem from corporate personhood. The media, everything's the one. Occupy. I mean, I'm so thrilled that Occupy exists, and I just hope it gets huge. But you have this convergence, and it really is the 1% against the 99%, or maybe even the 1/10 of 1% against, the 99%. It's the power of corporatism. Media is part of it. That's why they call it the corporate media. So I'm going to talk about the media today, but it's really, it's all the same thing. We wouldn't have a problem with healthcare if it wasn't part of the corporate industrial complex. We have the only system in the world that's basically run by for-profit interests, and the only incentive they have, the only goal they have, is to deny us health care because that's how they make money. And the media doesn't tell the truth because the media is part of this corporate industrial complex. So, it's really important to just keep this context in mind and realize that it's all part of the same thing. And it's all interrelated, and that's why we really all have an interest in being involved in each other's issues. And for me, I'm primarily involved in healthcare and pushing for single-payer healthcare, but it's so much bigger than that. And so that's kind of been my journey, because it's starting to coalesce and come together in my mind now on what we're really dealing with. And it's, but I really do think it all stems from corporate personhood. And maybe that's not even the right word, but certainly the power of corporate America and the way that it's preempted politics, preempted media, everything. But when we talk about the media and they're not doing their job, I think we really have to think about it as part of, they are part of the 1%. They're, that's who they are. But at any rate, let me
get some out.
Yeah. So what I put together is just kind of an overview. In 1983, and this actually isn't in here, but in 1983 there were 50 companies that combined represented about 90% of the media in this country. I'm talking about print, television, radio. And of course it's expanded now because you have social media and you have the internet. But today there are 6 companies that control over 90% of the media in this country. And when you look at, let me just here. This first page is the top 10 media companies, and I'm not even going to go through them. You can look at them, but the top 10 companies and the revenue that that each of them generated in 2010, and they control almost everything we see, almost everything we read, almost everything we listen to. I mean, we do have the internet, and thank God. And thank God for Glenn Greenwald. Does everybody know who Glenn Greenwald is? Glenn Greenwald, he used to write for Salon magazine. He's a constitutional scholar and a lawyer, and he's the one that broke the stories this week about how they are watching every one of our phone records. 200 million people are having their records captured by the NSA. And Glenn Greenwald revealed that, not in any American newspaper, by the way, in The Guardian, which is who he works for now. I think that in itself is kind of interesting. I think the public gets it because recent poll by Gallup, and they asked the question, in general, how much trust and confidence do you have in the mass media, such as newspapers, TV, and radio? This was done late 2012. I think this was in October. 60% of the public has not much or no faith at all in the American media, and that's an all-time high. And you see back in 1998 it was 53%, but it's by far an all-time high. The highest number before that was 57%, and that was in 2011. So the public is starting to understand that they can't be informed by the American media. I laid out, in particular, I started with GE, and we did a panel last year, and at that time, they're still the number one media company. They're a little smaller because Comcast has taken over 100% ownership of NBC, and it was a 50-50 venture. But when you look at GE, and they had $157 billion in revenue in 2010, and you look at that time they owned half of NBC, but Universal Pictures, Focus Fortunes, 26 television stations. And what I think people don't realize when you start looking, I looked at the interests of, or the other affiliations of the members of their boards of directors. And there is no, they're all interlinked. They're all on each other's boards of directors. So they have, just like we have an interest in fighting the 1%, they have an interest in preserving the 1%. And so their boards are also involved on the boards of the media, finance, institutions of higher learning. It's amazing when you look at the boards of directors of all these giant U.S. companies, the number of academics from the universities that sit on their boards. It permeates everything. Healthcare, pharmaceuticals, Fortune 500 companies, foundations, Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which, by the way, is, very involved in healthcare, but not single-payer healthcare. Culture, museums. There's all the major museums in New York. You look at the people that sit on their boards, and they're on the boards of every Fortune 500 company out there. Government, obviously, business organizations. And I laid out it's really one after the other. Comcast has now moved onto this list. They weren't on the list last year, but now that they own NBC, they're the number 6 company. They displaced CBS. And again, when you just look, they're involved in Fannie Mae, Bank of New York, Citigroup. And I don't really want to go through all this because I kind of like to see what everybody else here thinks. But these are the now actually 7 largest media corporations, because I left Viacom on the list and then I added Comcast. So these 7 probably account for 92 or 93% of the media in this country. But when you just look at the list, it's kind of repetitious to read it, but you can read it. They permeate everything, and so I think our roles, and again, you look at I was struck last week. I think there were 400 demonstrations against Monsanto all over the world. Some of them were huge. I think the only major media coverage was about a 10-second soundbite by CNN. It wasn't in the New York Times. It wasn't in, the major media ignored it. And the major media, I remember telling Chuck about Occupy. I was following it from day one, and Keith Olbermann was on it from the very beginning. But I talked to other people about what was going on with Occupy in New York, and nobody heard of it. It was like nobody in New York, the New York media wasn't covering it. They were all over the streets. But Occupy, and I think Occupy, I'm really glad you're here, because Occupy is another thing that just kind of tells us what's going on in this country. There's a real move. You have Move On. You have Democracy for America. The political establishment in this country is very good at inviting people to take a seat at the table and co-opting them. And they couldn't do that with Occupy, so they unleashed the power of the police state. It's kind of like you can have a seat at the table or we can beat the shit out of you. Sorry, pardon my French. But, and that's something we need to think about, because they're militarizing every police department in this country. Little Lancaster has a tank. or an anti-personality. Yeah. What?
They get it for free, right?
Well, Homeland Security paid for about 80% of it.
Right.
I think they're afraid of the Amish. I think that.
Yes. So, I mean, I think I've made my point, but, you know, it is the corporate media. They are not innocent standers-by. They are the gatekeepers, as far as I'm concerned. You know, we talk about the health insurance companies as the gatekeepers of healthcare in this country, which they are, which in itself is obscene. Well, the media are the gatekeepers for Wall Street and for the military-industrial complex and healthcare. And I'm not really, you know, we're supposed to offer solutions here, and it's kind of hard to offer solutions. I think we need to continue to embrace alternative media, social media to the extent. I mean, we really need to get corporations, get rid of corporate personhood, because we need to get corporate money out of politics. I don't think we're ever going to fix the problems until it's follow the money. Money controls the system, and you know, we have to find ways. I think Occupy is a good start. I personally would love to see Occupy get involved in politics and start running candidates for office. But I know that there's a large, you know, I know there's, that's a subject of intense discussion within the Occupy movement. I mean, a lot of us that are frustrated and don't see another way to go, and I don't really see the Green Party doing it. I'm sorry. I wish they would, but we need to do something. Occupy, I think, is one. I think they have the potential to really become a party, and you know, if they're worried about being co-opted, they just need to have faith in their ability to fight back and not be co-opted. So that's really where, you know, where I'm coming from. I don't think I need to go through everybody. I think has a copy of this, but that's kind of my evolution and how I see all of our problems. They're all related.
So as you're going through, John, a couple questions, because we're going to we'll do all the panel presentations and then bring it back to a discussion at the end, just to make sure everybody gets through the material. But we do want to give over a lot of time to Q&A. Thank you, Jerry. Appreciate it. So now we'll hear from Dr. Walter Hsu.
Well, thank you. So I have written up my comments, and if you want, there's a copy right here if you didn't get one earlier. But I want to talk today about the Affordable Care Act. And as most of you know, the Obama administration spent the first 2 years of its own political capital when it was first elected to pass the Affordable Care Act. And either that is considered the shining triumph of the Obama administration, and we're about to explore that, or as we're going to, maybe my cynical perspective, it's basically a giveaway, if you will, to the medical industrial complex, which in many ways triumphs and runs our healthcare system. Now, there's a good reason why the medical industrial complex has a lot of interest in this, and that is because as a nation, some of us may know this, we spend $2.8 trillion on healthcare every year. Now, when I usually talk to most groups, because of time, I usually tease them a little and I ask them, how much do you think we spend on healthcare? And usually the numbers are in the billions. And when I finally reveal that it's actually as much as $2.8 trillion in 1 year, people are just sort of aghast, because it's a number that most of us cannot even fathom. I often ask medical students how many zeros are in a trillion, and they have to sort of think about it. Not sure. I remind them there's 12 zeros. That's a lot of zeros. And when you have that much money on the line, and it's run by the medical industrial complex, you have to start thinking to yourself, how much is it worth for me to invest in shaping a healthcare legislation that will affect our industry for the next decade or 2 or 3 decades. And so when I tell people that for this one piece of legislation, the Affordable Care Act, the industry spent $1.2 billion in order to influence the outcome, that there are more lobbyists, I think like 6 or 7 lobbyists for every member of Congress from just the health industry alone. People are usually like astounded and aghast that people would spend that kind of money just to influence one piece of legislation. But actually, it's a bargain if you think about it, because $1.2 billion, and in order to influence something that spends $2.8 trillion, or over the course of the next decade, just in the 10 years, we will spend $37 trillion on health care. It is actually a bargain to spend $1.2 billion in order to influence the outcome of that piece of legislation. Now, you might ask ourselves, where are we going to find $37 trillion over the next decade in order to fund our healthcare system? And the answer is that all of us are going to spend that kind of money. And those of us who don't have the kind of money to finance that are going to find themselves either out of the system and out of luck, or you're going to find that if you're very lucky, you're going to be subsidized by the taxpayers. But it's more likely that you're going to be out of luck, because most people are not going to be able to come up with that kind of money in order to fund the Affordable Care Act. The top companies in America in terms of employment, it used to be back in the 1960s, were companies like General Motors, Ford, General Electric, and so on, basically large manufacturers in this country. The top 5 companies today that employ people in this country are all service-oriented companies. They're companies like Walmart, Kelly Services, McDonald's, and so on. Those are the jobs that we actually are creating in America today. What happened in the last 40 years that allowed us to basically shift our manufacturing base overseas? Well, largely it's because in a global economy, we have found that it's much cheaper to hire people from other countries to manufacture things and not to make things anymore in this country. Why would we do something like that? Well, one of the things that is most expensive for manufacturers is, in fact, the cost of health care. It is something that is totally within our potential control, and we as a nation have picked the most costly and expensive model for funding health care in the world by far. So if I had PowerPoint, I'd show you my graphs, but basically, if you were to see the United States per capita spending on health care compared to any other country, we are about 50% higher per capita on health care than any other country in the world. So suddenly you see this graph that sort of gradually looks up, and then suddenly one sort of sticks way up in the air, and that's the United States. If you look at graphs large enough on the global scale, you almost never see anything where one country's statistics are so out of line from every other country. And that is because the United States healthcare expenses, which is the number one most expensive fringe benefit of corporations, we've picked probably the most expensive way of financing healthcare in the world. And I believe that is one of the contributors over the last 40 years as to why manufacturers have chosen not to build things anymore in America, and why our whole healthcare system is contributing to much of the 6 million manufacturing jobs that have left this nation and moved us, I think, increasingly to one where we're going to be seeing ourselves as a second-class country. Now, who has benefited from that? Well, the medical industrial complex benefits greatly by the fact that our healthcare system is so expensive and that we largely can't afford it. It used to be in Pittsburgh, as this woman pointed out, that the tallest buildings in Pittsburgh were, I think, Gulf Oil and U.S. Steel, and Pittsburgh Plate Glass. And it's total irony that the two largest buildings, which are U.S. Steel and Gulf Oil, are now renamed UPMC, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and Highmark, which is the insurance company that runs Pittsburgh. So these two giants in the medical industrial complex have basically taken over the corporate towers of Pittsburgh, and it's a perfect paradigm of what has happened in almost every city in America, that the major job producers nowadays are part of the medical industrial complex. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. It leaves actually healthcare's a country where we have 50 million people without health insurance, way too expensive health care. But the elite, who basically get to control the healthcare system, they get Cadillac healthcare for themselves. They actually, it's almost in a Marie Antoinette way, let the rest of the world, rest of the United States eat cake, and we are left with mediocre care for the masses and sort of Cadillac elite care for the 1% that are out there. The mainstream media, as Jerry has pointed out, actually have been complicit in much of this. But it's actually interesting that there's a huge amount of interest by the American public around health care. Stephen Brill's article in the New York in the Time magazine on the bitter pill, which was a huge essay, if you will, on why healthcare costs so much in America, was the most read article in Time magazine in probably the last 4 or 5 years. So there are lots of people who are interested in this issue. Just as recently as 4 or 5 days ago, the New York Times published an interesting article about why colonoscopy costs so much in America compared to other countries, and why a routine preventive care program like colonoscopy should cost somewhere between $5,000 to $10,000 in America, where almost anywhere else in the world it's less than $1,000. That is a contributor to why our healthcare system is so expensive. And people who have figured out how to do colonoscopies have basically gamed the system so that it becomes the most expensive way of actually providing colonoscopy. Any efforts that we would really want to try to do to control healthcare costs will require some type of government intervention. And the medical industrial complex has done everything they can to assure that government intervention will not intercede in healthcare. So the Affordable Care Act, basically, even though it's called the Affordable Care Act, is all about preserving, if you will, the monopoly that the insurers and the pharmaceutical companies have on our healthcare system. And the greatest failure, I believe, that for the President Obama in this first 2 years is that he did not actually go out and use his bully pulpit to fight for a single-payer system, use government intervention, if you will, to actually rein in healthcare costs, which is destroying the manufacturing base of this country, and using this as a way of arguing for the American people that the most successful healthcare program that this country has ever seen in the last 45 years is the Medicare program, and that the simple solution that we could have done is to take Medicare and expand it to everybody. We may politically not been able to do it in one swoop, but certainly as a goal, he could have articulated saying, our goal maybe over the next 4 or 5 years, or maybe 10 years, is to expand Medicare to everybody, because that is actually the program that most Americans actually love, and the one that has been the most effective in controlling healthcare costs. Stephen Brill's article that I just mentioned about healthcare costs being out of control, he actually concludes by simply saying that were it not for the Medicare program, our healthcare costs would be even worse. And Medicare, if you think about it, I mean, the miracle about Medicare is that it serves the elderly, the disabled, and people on renal dialysis, arguably the most expensive people that you could care for in the country. And the fact that they are actually able to control healthcare costs better than the private insurance companies that cover healthy workers between 18 to 64 is a statement of how effective Medicare is in controlling health care costs and at the ultimate dismal failure of private health insurance itself. So we as a nation actually should do better and would do better if we actually had a single-payer system for this country. But the Affordable Care Act, it could be otherwise renamed the Anything But Single-Payer Plan, because it is essentially an effort by the medical industrial complex to keep their monopoly on the system itself and to exclude any type of government intervention. I mentioned to you that the top 5 companies in America in terms of employment now are like Walmart, McDonald's, Kelly Services, et cetera. Those are the companies that employ people. You should know that the top 5 companies in America in the future, sometime after next year, when all of us are going to be required to purchase private health insurance, and only private health insurance, no public option was ever allowed in the final plan, the top 5 companies are all going to be Aetna, WellPoint, United Healthcare, et cetera, all these private insurance companies. Because think about this, if you as now are told that the $2.8 trillion that we spend on healthcare are all going to be future financed by these for-profit private insurers, they are now going to be the dominant players out there. They're going to be the ones who are going to take over the revenue for our country. And Walmart, even though it's, I don't know, $150 or $200 billion corporation, it will pale in comparison to United Healthcare, which is going to get this enormous slice of the pie, as all of us are paying $10,000 premiums mandated by law to fund United, Aetna, Cigna, and all these other corporations. They're going to be the top 5 corporations in America. And what do you think they're going to do with that money? They're going to use that money essentially to pay any amount of money to the politicians in order to maintain their place at the top of the heap, in order to assure the continuation of the medical industrial complex as currently stated. And as Jerry noted earlier, because of corporate personhood and Citizens United, we have allowed by law the ability of corporations to spend any amount of money they want in order to maintain that system. So in conclusion, it's sort of a dismal picture, if you will, about what I think is the ultimate agenda for the Affordable Care Act. I am pleased, I should say, about the goals of the Affordable Care Act. That is to say that we will expand, hopefully, more people who can get health insurance, although we admittedly will still leave 30 million Americans uninsured. We will do it in the most expensive way that possible. That is to say, we will continue to spend 50% more per capita on health care than the rest of the world spends on health care. And we will do nothing, I think, in terms of trying to effectively change the dynamics of the healthcare system so that it is more people-oriented, that we re-enfranchise the 50 million people without health insurance, and that we can actually truly control healthcare costs through something like a single-payer system, unless we, the people in this room, and other people, start waking up to the fact that we have basically handed over our fortune, our premiums, et cetera, to this crazy scheme under the Affordable Care Act, and that we should do something about trying to take back the healthcare system into the hands of the American people. So I'll stop. Thank you.
Well, can I do one quick footnote
Yeah.
on yours? Walter mentioned the Stephen Brill article several times. If you haven't read it, it's a very long piece. It was a cover story. It's almost 50 pages long. When it first came out, it was available for free on the internet, and about 2 weeks later, Time put it behind their subscription wall. If anybody here, I would really urge you all to read it. It's a really important piece, and if any of you are interested and haven't read it, if you give me your email address, I downloaded it before they put it behind the subscription wall. So I will be happy to send it to you via email. And it's really a must-read. And since then, he has gone full circle. He seemed to keep going right up to endorsing single payer as the solution, and didn't, possibly because it appeared in Time. But he has since gone full circle, and he is now openly supporting single payer as the solution. So just, before you leave today, give me your email address and I will send you the article, unless you want to subscribe to Time, because that's the only other way to get it.
Thanks, Jerry. Julian?
Yeah, thanks, Walter and Chuck and Jerry. So let's see, I want to talk a bit about the problem of money in politics and how it is the means by which the 1% basically get a majority share in our democracy. And also I want to talk about some solutions and have some dialogue about what we could actually do about it. Before I get into that, though, I have to say it's great to see Kurt. I mean, my first full-time organizing job out of college was canvassing on West 72nd Street, as I mentioned, starting there, and Kurt worked with Kurt back then. And I have to note also, by coincidence, that today is my daughter's first full day as an environmental canvasser for her summer job. So, so time moves on, but sort of activism keeps going. So. It's great to see you and to be with all of you today. Let's see, as far as how this system works, I mean, well, we're here to talk about the medical industrial media complex. I think it's also could be relevant to tie it to this theme of ecological and economic transformation that's the theme of this year's conference, because the role of corporate control, media concentration, and money in politics could easily be applied to environmental issues as well, and the failure to deal with climate change in a meaningful way. I was thinking about this, and it's sad that too often when a politician thinks of green, they're more likely to be thinking of corporate cash than they are of sound environmental policy, or for that matter, sound healthcare policy as well. So I mean, too often the corporate money calls the shots, whether it's big oil and gas blocking environmental reform, or health insurance companies like Walter was talking about, or pharmaceutical manufacturers that are profiting so much from that $2.8 trillion a year healthcare system, and they're, as Walter said, they're using that money for campaign contributions, for lobbyists, for advertising, public relations, to make sure that a lot of issues like single payer, they're too often doing these things to make sure that options like single payer aren't allowed to be part of the mainstream debate or discussion. And I liked what, your name, sir, was Dave. You talked about, I believe you talked about finding common ground with people.
Well, divide and conquer on both sides.
Right. I mean, I think there is a lot of potential, no matter what issues you care about. If you accept the basic idea that we ought to have a democracy in this country, you ought to be for some kind of campaign reform. And then we could fight it out in a fair playing field. But as long as and there are a lot of people we may disagree with on some issues who would agree that we ought to have at least a functional democracy and a fair system where everyone has a fair chance to win their point of view through open debate, fair elections, free speech, all those things that are supposed to be at the core of our Constitution and what America is supposed to stand for. So before getting to solutions, I just want to spell out a little bit more about the nature of the problem. I think intuitively we all know that too often, they talk about the golden rule, whoever has the gold rules, that's kind of the nature of our political system too often. But just to put some specifics on that, I mean, one problem is, in terms of change, incumbents have vastly more money than challengers in our political system. In the last, just to illustrate that, in the last election, the average incumbent U.S. senator had about $12 million for his or her campaign, and the average challenger had about $1.4 million, or just barely over a tenth of what the incumbent had. In U.S. House races, it was about $1.6 million on average for incumbents to $270,000 on average for challengers. So you can see that, I mean, it's very hard to hold the incumbents accountable for their failure to deal with these issues in a meaningful way when the system is that slanted. Overall spending went up, has more than doubled since 2000. It was, as documented campaign spending was $6.3 billion in the last election cycle, which we know also that there's a lot of undocumented spending thanks to the Citizens United ruling. And the Koch brothers, for example, is just one example, are thought to have put over $100 million alone, just two brothers, into our electoral system. And if they funnel it through nonprofit 501c4s, it doesn't have to be reported, basically. They can launder the money through these groups, like, and there's the Carl Rove's organization, American Crossroads, spent $175 million that we know of. And a lot of this also could be hidden. I don't know how many of you saw Stephen Colbert's Super PAC. I enjoyed. I'd recommend you look that up. And I mean, it was funny, but if you think about it, it was pretty sad too, that he could do these things. He made an open joke out of what's the actual system. He didn't have to. Reality has become parody when it comes to our electoral system now, and he drove that home very well. So just some examples before we turn to solutions and dialogue of just the major sectors in terms of giving. We know that look at Wall Street. We talk about Occupy Wall Street. In the 2012 election cycle, donations from PACs and individuals working for law firms, business service firms, and banks, like Bank of America, Citibank, et cetera, collectively gave what's documented $578 million to candidates. And these are the guys who are supposed to make the decisions about regulating Wall Street, financial reform, to make sure we don't have another financial meltdown. But they're taking this kind of money from the very people who are getting rich, who got rich off the system and continue to get rich. And then they funnel a small amount of their profits back into maintaining control of the political system, or at least doing everything they can to have as much control as possible over it. So that's Wall Street. If you look at the pharmaceutical and healthcare and insurance industries, documented, we know there's $250 million that they put in the last election cycle. This is just campaign contributions. We're not talking about the money they spend on lobbyists, public relations. I mean, I don't know if you know the figure, Walter. I read somewhere, I forget how many dozens of health industry lobbyists there were per each member of Congress, but they would barely have enough time to, do anything else if they were just returning phone calls from the lobbyists from these industries.
Something like 60. It's a number that's just in my head.
I know it's dozens per member at least.
60,000 registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C. as of 2 years ago, and they're paid on average $375,000 a year.
Right.
As a 2-year-old.
Right. And they talk about when you take their money, you have to at least return their phone calls and give them access. They say they're not selling their votes, but a lot of them will admit they're selling access. But if that they'll return the phone calls when they got 100 phone calls. They're going to make sure they return the phone calls from the lobbyists, from the people who are giving them money. And access.
Special interest is 60 to 1. Something like that.
Yeah.
That's the number that registers. I'm not sure.
Right. So it's, and then you can talk about oil and gas as well as, Wall Street, oil and gas, healthcare industry. They're all pouring many, many more times. It's by ratios of 50 to 1, 60 to 1 compared to the progressive forces lobbying on the other side. So, and then on top of that, the system was bad enough until 2010 when the Citizens United ruling came down by a 5-4 majority. This country, for all the flaws in the system, we did have a ban on direct corporate campaign contributions from 1907. It was passed under Theodore Roosevelt until 2010. So for over 100 years, corporations couldn't make direct campaign contributions, but John Roberts, Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas, Antonin Scalia, they all teamed up to basically overthrow 100 years of more than a century of a ban on direct corporate campaign contributions. And that really creates a challenge for us. That it creates this possibility of these super PACs, the secret money, undisclosed money funneled through third parties, and it makes a difficult situation that much harder. But I think that's enough about the problem. I don't want people to be feeling too discouraged, because we have to do something about it if we're going to save our democracy. We can't just say, oh, well, it's, you know, the deck is stacked against us. What can we do? You know, we're going to bitch and moan and just feel, you know, sorry for ourselves. We have to think of a plan of action and do something about it. So there are a lot of there is a lot of action at the local level to have campaign reform. There are states that are enacting campaign reform laws, and cities as well. I know one thing, just as a direct reaction to the Citizens United ruling, one place to start is Montana and Colorado were two states that they had ballot initiatives to say that they wanted to direct their representatives in those states to overturn the Citizens United ruling and support efforts to have a constitutional amendment to allow government to restrict campaign spending and corporate contributions again, to overturn this notion of corporate personhood that Jerry and Walter were talking about. I remember there was that famous moment during the campaign where Mitt Romney on the hay bale and the Iowa Fair said, you know, corporations are people, my friend. You know, and they really seem to believe this, you know, that I don't know if they think they bleed and die and get married and, you know, get sick, but they do seem to think that they should have even more rights than the rest of us, because there are actually limits on what individuals can give, but there aren't limits on what corporations can give. So they're even saying corporations are better than people when it comes to rights under our Constitution, and that shouldn't be acceptable. No one should accept that, no matter what whether you're, you know, far right, conservative, far left, wherever you are on the political spectrum. We all ought to agree that you know, it's supposed to be we the people, and people should mean human beings, not corporations. So constitutional amendments, just to give you an idea how they did in Montana, which went, you know, is a pretty conservative state. There is a progressive movement there, but the voters in Montana last November voted 75% to overturn this notion of corporate personhood and direct their representatives to try to overturn Citizens United. In Colorado, there was